In the ancient world, gods were not always seen as benevolent protectors or sources of comfort. Many of them were feared more than they were loved, and their cults revolved around rituals that demanded blood, fire, and offerings of terrible gravity. Few figures capture this darker side of religion as clearly as Moloch, a name that still resonates as a symbol of dread and sacrifice. Mentioned in biblical texts and condemned by prophets, Moloch has come down to us not only as a deity of old, but as an archetype of human devotion pushed to its most destructive extremes. To speak of Moloch is to speak of the shadow side of faith, where reverence for the divine becomes inseparable from terror and loss. The figure of Moloch looms especially large when we turn our attention to the practice of child sacrifice. Across early civilizations, the offering of children to the gods carried a symbolic weight unlike any other ritual. To sacrifice an adult was one thing. It could be understood as an act of loyalty, a repayment of debt, or the honoring of warriors and captives who represented the strength of a tribe. But to offer a child meant something far more profound. Children embodied innocence, purity, and the continuation of a people's future. To surrender them to the flames was not only an offering of life, it was the surrender of hope, of lineage, of the very possibility of tomorrow. This act, horrifying to modern sensibilities, was in its original context a declaration that no price was too great to secure divine favor or to stave off divine wrath. The question of why such rites existed has haunted historians, theologians, and occult scholars alike. Why would a people bind their survival to such terrible gestures? Part of the answer lies in the human need to bridge the gap between mortality and the divine, to demonstrate in the most tangible way that nothing was withheld from the gods, not even the most precious of possessions. In this way, sacrifice was more than a ritual. It was a conversation between humanity and eternity, a statement written in blood and fire. This is why the story of Moloch remains significant even in our modern age. It is not only a tale of ancient cults or forgotten temples, but a reflection of how human beings have understood power, obligation, and the sacred. The rites attributed to Moloch challenge us to look at the lengths to which people will go to appease forces they believe to be greater than themselves. They also force us to ask how symbols of destruction can persist across centuries, taking new forms in literature, philosophy, and even political discourse. When we explore the cult of Moloch, we are not only uncovering the history of early human sacrifice, we are also confronting the enduring shadow of devotion itself, the side of religion that reveals as much about human fear as it does about faith. The origins of Moloch lie in the tangled web of ancient Near Eastern religion, where deities were not static figures but shifting powers, often merging, evolving, and being reinterpreted by different peoples across centuries. In the case of Moloch, scholars point to the Canaanite and Phoenician worlds as the soil from which his image first grew. These cultures were polytheistic, with pantheons that contained gods of fertility, storms, the sea, and the underworld. Moloch appears to have been connected to the sphere of sacrifice and fire, a god not of gentle harvests or benevolent rains, but of consuming devotion and the terrifying promise of destruction turned into favor. The Hebrew Bible makes several references to Moloch, though the exact nature of this figure is contested. In the book of Leviticus, we find prohibitions against passing children through the fire to Moloch, an act described as an abomination. The prophet Jeremiah condemns the construction of altars in the valley of Hinnom where children were offered to this god, saying that such practices were never commanded by Israel's own deity and stood as a rebellion against him. These passages paint Moloch not simply as another god among many, but as the embodiment of a rival system of worship, one that demanded from its adherents the most costly of tributes. To the biblical writers, Moloch was not only a theological enemy, but a symbol of moral corruption, a god who inverted the sacredness of life by demanding its destruction. Later interpretations, particularly in the rabbinic and Christian traditions, intensified this image. Some writers described Moloch as a massive bronze idol with outstretched arms, beneath which a furnace burned. Into this furnace, or onto these arms, the children were placed, consumed by fire as part of the ritual. Whether this image was literal or polemical is debated, but what matters is the symbolic picture it created. Moloch as the fiery mouth of devotion, a god who transformed innocence into smoke. Through centuries of repetition, this imagery hardened, and Moloch became the name for an archetypal hunger that devoured what was most beloved in exchange for fleeting security or power. It is also significant to note Moloch's associations with fire. Fire was not merely destructive, it was purifying, transformative, and linked to the presence of the divine across many ancient religions. To feed the flames with human life was to dramatize the surrender of mortal flesh to the consuming power of the gods. The offering of children became an ultimate form of this symbolic equation, the purest possible life force consumed by the holiest or most terrifying of flames. In this way, Moloch stood at the crossroads of two powerful associations, the sacredness of life and the cleansing, devouring force of fire. When bound together, they created a theology of sacrifice that was as captivating as it was horrifying. Moloch, then, was never just a local god of the Canaanites. He was a figure whose meaning rippled outward, carried into the narratives of rival peoples, demonized by Israelite prophets, and remembered by later ages as the god who represented the terrible demands of faith taken to its extreme. Whether or not there was ever a cult that worshipped him exactly as described in later accounts, the figure of Moloch condensed into one image the anxieties and practices of a region where sacrifice was central to the religious imagination. To trace his origins is to glimpse the earliest moments when the human need to sacrifice, to appease, and to transform life through ritual was fused with the figure of a god who embodied fire, offering, and the very sacredness of life force itself. To understand why Moloch became such a potent figure, we first have to step back and look at the nature of sacrifice itself. Sacrifice was not a strange or marginal practice in the ancient world, it was universal. Every culture, from the banks of the Nile to the mountains of Mesopotamia, and from the early cities of the Levant to the far reaches of Mesoamerica, offered sacrifices to their gods. It was the heartbeat of religious life, the rhythm by which people maintained contact with the divine. For ancient peoples, sacrifice was not symbolic play-acting, but a literal act of exchange, a binding covenant between humans and the powers they believed shaped their world. At its core, sacrifice carried the logic of reciprocity. Humans depended on the gods for rain, for fertility, for victory in war, for protection against plague and famine. In return, the gods demanded proof of loyalty. To offer food, grain, or animals was the most common form of sacrifice, but these were not mere gifts. They were transactions. By giving up something valuable, the people secured divine attention. But when fear deepened, when survival was on the line, when the community felt the crushing weight of drought or defeat, the offering escalated. The greater the need, the greater the sacrifice. And at the top of that hierarchy stood the most precious offering of all, human life. The sacrifice of adults carried its own gravity. War captives, slaves, or chosen individuals could be dedicated to the gods, but the offering of children occupied a place of singular intensity. Children were the living embodiment of innocence, of new beginnings, of the untainted spark of life. they were also the most valuable possession a family or a tribe could claim, because in them rested not only emotional attachment, but the continuation of the bloodline and the promise of a future. To surrender them was to surrender everything. This made child sacrifice the ultimate test of devotion. It was an act that demonstrated to the gods and to the community itself that no limit had been set, that nothing was being held back. But there is also a psychological dimension to this act that cannot be overlooked. The offering of children is shocking to us precisely because it cuts against the deepest instincts of preservation and protection. To commit such an act requires a complete surrender of personal will to divine authority, the erasure of the self in favor of an absolute loyalty to something greater. In this sense, sacrifice was not only about giving up something external, but also about transforming the worshipper's inner state. The willingness to give what should never be given revealed the depth of devotion. In the context of Moloch's cult, the ritual of passing children through fire dramatized this inner submission, showing that the worshippers were willing to place even the most sacred bond on the altar. This practice also had a communal dimension. Sacrifice was rarely private. It was public, collective, performed in front of the community, often led by priests or rulers. When a child was offered, it was not only the parents who participated, but the entire people, who shared in the guilt, the fear, and the supposed blessing that would follow. In this way, the act bound the community together through a shared ordeal. The horror of the sacrifice was matched by the intensity of solidarity it created. The gods demanded, and the people obeyed, proving their unity in the face of divine judgment. When we look at sacrifice through this lens, the rites associated with Moloch make a grim kind of sense. They were not random acts of cruelty, but rituals that crystallized the ancient logic of offering, exchange, and transformation. Sacrifice was about bridging the chasm between human vulnerability and divine power. And when the stakes were highest, nothing less than the life of a child could be considered a fitting bridge. This is what gave Moloch his terrible gravity. He stood as the god who received what no one else could rightfully claim, the god whose worship erased the final barrier between devotion and destruction. When we turn directly to the cult of Moloch, we are entering into one of the most disturbing and yet fascinating aspects of ancient religion. For centuries, stories have circulated about how these rites were performed, how they were organized, and what symbols defined them. Even though many of the details come to us from hostile sources, biblical prophets condemning the practice, historians writing with moral outrage, or theologians trying to vilify foreign gods, the picture that emerges is one of rituals both terrifying in their immediacy and powerful in their symbolic weight. The practices attributed to Moloch worshippers center on fire, on furnaces, on braziers where the offerings would be consumed. The image most often repeated is that of a towering idol, made of bronze, its arms stretched forward or upward, heated until it glowed with the unbearable intensity of flame. Into this figure's embrace, the children were placed, sometimes passing through the fire, sometimes laid upon its burning hands before falling into the furnace below. Whether or not this exact depiction was ever a literal reality, it captures the essence of the cult, an encounter with fire as the medium between human life and divine hunger. Fire was the purifier, the destroyer, the great transformer, and Moloch was the god who embodied this force in its most terrifying form. Such rituals were not chaotic or uncontrolled outbursts of violence. They were orchestrated ceremonies. Priests presided over them, mediating between the people and the god. The king or ruling elite often participated as well, for these offerings were more than religious gestures. They were political acts, demonstrating the ruler's absolute loyalty to the divine order and demanding the same from the subjects. When a child was sacrificed, it was not only a family's private grief, but a declaration of the community's submission to Moloch. It showed that the people, from the lowest parent to the highest ruler, were willing to pay the ultimate price for divine favor. The symbolism of the fire itself cannot be overstated. To offer a child into the flames was to acknowledge that life must be consumed to be renewed, that the most precious thing must be destroyed in order for the community to live. It was a dramatization of the paradox of sacrifice. Only through loss could there be gain. Only through destruction could there be renewal. This was the theology of Moloch's cult, a theology that placed fire at the center of the sacred drama. We can also imagine the sensory intensity of these rituals. The heat of the flames, the roar of fire, the cries of the people, perhaps even the sound of drums or horns to mask the horror. All of these elements combined to create an atmosphere that overwhelmed the senses and impressed itself indelibly on the community's memory. In this way, the ritual did more than secure divine favor. It seared itself into the minds of all who witnessed it, binding them together in a shared experience of terror, reverence, and awe. What is striking is how these rituals turned the act of killing into something more than destruction. For the worshippers of Moloch, sacrifice was not murder, but transformation. The child did not simply die, it was offered, transmuted through flame, turned into smoke rising toward the heavens. The life was not lost. It was given, translated into a different form, absorbed by the God who, in turn, would bestow protection or blessing upon the people. To outsiders, this was cruelty. To the insiders, it was devotion of the highest order. Thus, the cult of Moloch reveals to us the extremes of religious logic. It shows us how a community can rationalize the most horrifying of acts when it is framed as necessary for survival, as holy, as demanded by the divine. It was a system where priests and kings mediated between God and people, where fire became the sacred tool of transformation, and where children, the most innocent and precious of offerings, were placed into the furnace to secure the favor of a deity who embodied both the terror and the necessity of sacrifice. The cult of Moloch did not exist in isolation. The ancient Near East was a complex network of interconnected societies, and religious practices often traveled along trade routes, through conquest, or via cultural assimilation. As such, the rituals attributed to Moloch appear to have resonated with, and in some cases influenced, the practices of neighboring civilizations. Perhaps the most notorious parallel can be found in Carthaginian religion, particularly in rites devoted to Baal-Hamon. Archaeological evidence and classical sources suggest that Carthaginians, much like the worshippers of Moloch, engaged in sacrificial rituals that sometimes included children. The similarities are striking. The use of fire, the public and ceremonial nature of the offering, and the high stakes of devotion all echo the patterns seen in the Canaanite and Phoenician contexts. Beyond Carthage, there were also echoes in Mesopotamian practices. While direct evidence of child sacrifice in Mesopotamia is more limited, the broader culture of offering, burning incense, pouring libations, dedicating valuable possessions, and occasionally offering life, illustrates that the logic of devotion through costly offering was widely shared. The Near Eastern mindset placed enormous importance on reciprocity with the divine, and in moments of extreme crisis, the offerings became extreme as well. Sacrifice, particularly of the most precious beings, was a way to negotiate with a cosmos that was otherwise incomprehensible and uncontrollable. In addition, these practices shaped the perception and development of early Israelite religion. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly contrasts Moloch worship with Yahweh worship, emphasizing the prohibitions against child sacrifice as a defining moral and theological line. This opposition was not merely doctrinal but cultural. It highlights how the presence of Moloch's cult in neighboring societies forced Israelite leaders and prophets to clarify and codify their own religious practices, emphasizing life, obedience, and symbolic rather than literal offerings. In this sense, Moloch's shadow directly shaped the contours of a rival faith, prompting both legal and prophetic literature that defined acceptable forms of devotion and the consequences of crossing sacred boundaries. What emerges from these comparisons is not a simple story of imitation or borrowing, but a complex web of interaction. The figure of Moloch, with his fiery demands and terrifying authority, acted as a kind of archetype in the region, crystallizing the extreme form of sacrifice and offering that could be adapted, resisted, or transformed by neighboring peoples. Some adopted the imagery, some mirrored the rituals in localized forms, and some used it as a cautionary tale, a warning of what human devotion could become when untempered by moral restraint. Across cultures, Moloch's presence was a point of reference, whether as a literal deity, a model of extreme ritual, or a symbolic warning against the destructive potential of unchecked piety. Through these cultural exchanges, the shadow of Moloch spread far beyond any single temple or city. The figure became both a concrete object of ritual and an abstract marker of devotion's ultimate cost, influencing how neighboring societies imagined the stakes of their own offerings. The terrifying logic of his cult, children into the flames, life transformed into smoke, devotion tested to its limits, was echoed in multiple contexts, leaving a lingering imprint on the religious imagination of the entire ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Over time, Moloch evolved from a feared god to a symbol of moral and spiritual corruption, his image transformed by the very cultures that condemned him. In the Hebrew Bible, he was already a figure of warning, a deity whose worship was explicitly prohibited, whose altars were abominations to the prophets, and whose rites represented the inversion of all that was sacred and just. But as centuries passed, the depiction of Moloch shifted from the historical and ritualistic into the allegorical and moralistic. He became not only the object of ritual fear, but also a metaphor for any force that demanded extreme devotion at the cost of human life and dignity. This process of demonization is crucial to understanding Moloch's enduring power as a symbol. Writers and theologians recast him as the embodiment of all that is perverse in devotion, the archetype of a god who hungers for destruction rather than life. In prophetic texts, the valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, became synonymous with judgment, and Moloch's image merged with the very notion of hell itself. His fiery demands were no longer simply part of ancient ritual. They represented the moral perils of submitting to any authority that consumes innocence for its own sake. In literature and philosophy, Moloch emerged as a shorthand for systems, institutions, or ideologies that sacrifice what is most precious to sustain themselves, whether that be children, virtue, or freedom. The transformation of Moloch from deity to symbol also reflects a broader human need to externalize and dramatize fear. By turning Moloch into a monstrous archetype, cultures could confront the anxieties surrounding sacrifice, power, and obedience without being forced to replicate the literal acts themselves. He became the ultimate warning. Devotion taken to extremes, if left unchecked, can demand the impossible and devour the innocent. In this sense, the demonization of Moloch is both protective and explanatory. It warns societies against repeating ancient mistakes, while offering a narrative structure to understand why such practices existed in the first place. Moreover, this symbolic evolution allowed Moloch to persist into modern times. From romantic literature to political critique, the figure has been invoked as a metaphor for oppressive systems that consume what humans value most. He is invoked when discussing war, industrialization, greed, and bureaucracy, all forces that, metaphorically, feed on human life, energy, and innocence. The god who once demanded literal fire now exists in the cultural imagination as a warning against moral compromise, the elevation of ideology over life, and the seductive danger of absolute authority. In occult and esoteric interpretations, Moloch has taken on yet another dimension, one less concerned with literal morality and more with the psychology of sacrifice and transformation. He is sometimes seen as a symbol of destructive ambition, a shadow figure representing the part of human consciousness willing to destroy what is most precious to attain power or enlightenment. In this reading, the child consumed by fire becomes a metaphor for the ego or the untransformed self, and the ritual becomes a lesson in what is lost when devotion, obsession, or desire is untethered from ethical grounding. Through these layers of transformation and demonization, Moloch's figure has endured far beyond any single temple, city, or ritual. He is both historical and mythological, both cautionary and instructive, a god who once demanded the ultimate devotion and now stands as a symbol of the consequences of giving too much, sacrificing too freely, and surrendering to forces that consume more than they give. The evolution of Moloch from cultic deity to archetype of destructive devotion is a testament to how human cultures wrestle with the darkest aspects of their own spirituality, memory, and imagination. The story of Moloch, from his earliest appearances in Canaanite and Phoenician contexts to his enduring presence in modern occult thought, reveals a complex interplay between history, ritual, and symbol. He is not merely a figure of ancient myth, but a lens through which we can examine the extremes of human devotion, the terrifying logic of sacrifice, and the ways in which societies negotiate the boundary between survival and morality. By exploring his role in shaping early human sacrifice rites, we begin to understand not only the historical practices themselves, but also the psychological, social, and spiritual forces that gave rise to them. Moloch's dual legacy is striking. On one hand, there is the historical reality, communities confronting the precariousness of life, offering their most precious possessions in the hope of securing divine favor, and enacting rituals that dramatize devotion in the most visceral of terms. Children were offered not merely as symbols, but as living embodiments of continuity, purity, and hope, placed into fire to bridge the gap between mortality and the divine. These practices, whether fully literal or partially symbolic, demonstrate the intensity with which early humans approached questions of survival, destiny, and cosmic favor. On the other hand, there is the symbolic and archetypal Moloch, the figure who survives centuries beyond any altar or furnace. He embodies the consequences of devotion pushed to extremes, the hunger of authority and ideology for what is most precious, and the shadow dimension of human psychology that demands acknowledgement. In literature, philosophy, and occult thought, Moloch continues to serve as a warning and a mirror, a reminder of the cost of surrendering innocence, the danger of obsession, and the transformative, often destructive power of sacrifice. His image forces reflection on what is given, what is consumed, and what is retained when life, energy, or spirit is offered to forces greater than the self. In contemplating Moloch, we are compelled to confront fundamental questions about the nature of devotion, the ethics of offering, and the human relationship to power and the sacred. We see that sacrifice, in its most extreme forms, is never purely physical. It is psychological, social, and symbolic, intertwining the lives of individuals with the collective memory and moral imagination of a people. Moloch, as both historical figure and archetypal symbol, reveals the tension between reverence and horror, between the need to give and the cost of giving too much. Ultimately, Moloch endures because he represents something profoundly human. He embodies the paradox of devotion, the desire to honor and protect, expressed through acts that may destroy what we hold most dear. He stands at the intersection of fear and faith, of destruction and transformation, reminding us that the forces we worship or obey, whether gods, ideologies, or inner compulsions, have the power to consume as much as they sustain. To study Moloch is not merely to peer into the rituals of the past, but to confront the shadow dimensions of human aspiration, the price of obedience, and the enduring tension between the sacred and the terrible that defines the human experience.